June 4th, 1942. For minutes. That's all it took to change the entire course of World War II in the Pacific. For minutes where American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese aircraft carriers completely defenseless and turned them into floating infernos. But what if those American planes had arrived just 5 minutes later? What if Japanese fighters had been in position? What if Japan had won at Midway? Let me show you how the Pacific War would have gone completely differently. The Battle of Midway is taught as this decisive American victory. Japan's navy gets crushed, they never recover. America island hops all the way to Tokyo. But here's what nobody tells you. Midway was pure luck. The timing was absurd. The intelligence was a gamble. The entire battle hinged on a handful of dive bombers showing up at the exact right moment when Japanese carriers had their planes on deck refueling and rearming. If literally anything had gone slightly different, Japan wins. And if Japan wins at Midway, the Pacific War doesn't end in 1945. It might not end at all. Today we're exploring that nightmare scenario. And trust me, it gets dark fast. Before we dive into what happens if Japan wins, you need to understand just how close they actually came to winning. Because Midway wasn't some overwhelming American victory. It was chaos, luck, and split-second timing. Let's set the scene. It's June 1942. Japan has been winning everything since Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They destroyed the American battleship fleet at Pearl. They took the Philippines. They captured Singapore, which the British said was impossible. They took the Dutch East Indies with all those oil fields. They bombed Darwin in Australia. Hong Kong gone. Burma gone. The entire Western Pacific is now Japanese territory. And the American people are terrified because it looks like Japan can't be stopped. Admiral Yamamoto, the guy who planned Pearl Harbor, knows Japan needs to finish off the American carriers. As long as those carriers are out there somewhere in the Pacific, they're a threat. So he comes up with a plan. Attack Midway Island, a tiny American base halfway between Hawaii and Japan. Force the American carriers to come defend it. Then ambush them and sink them all. Once the carriers are gone, Hawaii is defenseless. Japan can either invade it or force America to negotiate peace. It's actually a solid plan. The Americans, thanks to codebreakers, know the attack is coming. Admiral Nimitz sets up his own ambush. He positions 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway and waits for the Japanese fleet to show up. The Japanese have 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all veterans from Pearl Harbor, the best carrier crews in the world. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese planes attack Midway Island. The base gets hammered, but it's not completely destroyed. The Japanese Admiral, Nagumo, has to make a decision. Does he launch a second strike on Midway? Or does he keep his planes armed with torpedoes in case American ships show up? He chooses to rearm for a second attack on the island. This takes time. Planes have to land. Bombs have to be swapped out. The carrier decks are covered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ammunition. It's a mess. Then a Japanese scout plane radios in. American ships spotted. Nagumo freaks out. He orders the planes rearmed again, this time with torpedoes for ships. More chaos. More delays. And while all this is happening, American torpedo bombers find the Japanese fleet. Wave after wave of American torpedo bombers attack. And they get slaughtered. The Japanese Zero fighters shoot them down like target practice. Out of 41 torpedo bombers from the Hornet, only 1 survives. 15 torpedo bombers from Enterprise, all shot down. The attack is a complete failure. Not a single torpedo hits a Japanese carrier. The American crews die for nothing. At this point, if you're on the Japanese side, you think you've won. You just destroyed most of the American attack force. But here's where luck comes in. Those torpedo bomber attacks pulled all the Japanese fighters down to sea level. The fighters are busy chasing the last torpedo bombers. Their fuel is running low, and they're out of position. And at that exact moment, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrive at high altitude. Nobody's protecting the Japanese carriers. The decks are still covered with planes being rearmed. Fuel lines are open. It's a perfect target. The dive bombers push over and drop. Bombs hit Akagi. Bombs hit Kaga. Bombs hit Soryu. All 3 carriers are engulfed in flames within minutes. The bombs set off the fuel and ammunition on the decks. Secondary explosions rip through the ships. Within hours, all 3 are sinking. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launches a counterattack and cripples the Yorktown. But American planes find Hiryu later that afternoon and destroy it too. By the end of the day, Japan has lost all 4 carriers. It's the turning point of the Pacific War. But here's the thing. If those American dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes earlier, the Japanese fighters would have still been at altitude and shot them down. If they'd arrived 10 minutes later, the Japanese would have launched their own attack, and the American carriers would have been the ones caught with planes on deck. The timing had to be perfect, and it was perfect by pure accident. So what if it wasn't? What if the American dive bombers got lost, which almost happened? What if they arrived too early or too late? What if a Japanese scout had spotted the American carriers an hour earlier and Nagumo had launched his strike first? What if Japan wins the Battle of Midway? Let's find out. Let's say the timing goes wrong for the Americans. The dive bombers from Enterprise get lost and can't find the Japanese fleet. Or they arrive too early and get intercepted by Zeros. Or the Japanese scouts spot the American carriers first and Nagumo launches his strike before the Americans can attack. Any of these scenarios, and suddenly it's Japanese bombers hitting American carriers instead of the other way around. The Japanese are good at this. They've been training for carrier warfare for years. Their pilots have combat experience from China and Pearl Harbor. They know what they're doing. Let's say they hit Enterprise first. Bombs and torpedoes slam into the carrier. Fires break out. The ship starts listing. Enterprise is either sinking or so badly damaged it has to withdraw. Then they hit Hornet. Same thing. 2 American carriers are gone in the first strike. Yorktown is already damaged from the Coral Sea battle a month earlier. It's barely operational. The Japanese find it and finish it off. Now all 3 American carriers are sunk or out of action. The Japanese have won the Battle of Midway. They've lost some planes, and maybe one of their carriers gets damaged, but they still have 3 or 4 operational carriers. The Americans have 0 in the entire Pacific. The immediate consequences are catastrophic for the United States. Midway Island itself probably falls. Without carriers to defend it, the Japanese can just keep bombing it until the garrison surrenders or gets wiped out. But that's the least of America's problems. With no carriers, the entire Central Pacific is wide open. Admiral Yamamoto now has options he didn't have in our timeline. He can invade Hawaii. It sounds crazy, but think about it. Hawaii's defenses were designed around the battleship fleet, which is sitting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The carrier fleet was supposed to protect the islands, but now that's gone too. There are some army units on Oahu, some coastal guns, but nothing that can stop a determined Japanese invasion force backed by 4 aircraft carriers. If Japan takes Hawaii, even just Oahu with Pearl Harbor, the psychological impact on America is devastating. Hawaii isn't a state yet in 1942, but it's still American territory. It's the stepping stone between the U.S. mainland and Asia. Losing it means the West Coast is now in range of Japanese attacks. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, they're all looking at the possibility of Japanese bombers or even invasion forces. The panic is real. But let's say Japan doesn't invade Hawaii. Maybe they think it's too risky or they don't have enough troops. They still have other options. They can invade Fiji and Samoa, cutting the supply line between the United States and Australia. In our timeline, America used Australia as a base to launch offensives north toward Japan. Without that supply line, Australia is isolated and can't be used as a base. Australia itself might face invasion, or at least major raids on cities like Sydney and Melbourne. The Australian government is already terrified in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, they might seek a separate peace with Japan. New Zealand is in the same boat. Isolated, cut off, facing possible invasion. India is under threat because Japan controls Burma and now has the naval power to raid the Indian Ocean. The British, who are barely holding on in Europe and North Africa, can't spare forces to defend India properly. There's a real possibility that India sees massive Japanese-supported uprisings that break British control. China, which has been fighting Japan since 1937, loses all hope of American support. In our timeline, American supplies were flowing into China to keep them in the fight. Those supplies came by sea or through Burma. With Japan controlling the seas and having taken Burma, China is cut off. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government might collapse entirely. China could be forced into a humiliating peace treaty that leaves Japan in control of all the territory they've seized. Millions more Chinese civilians die from starvation, disease, and Japanese atrocities. Back in America, the reaction is pure chaos. Roosevelt is under enormous pressure. The Pacific Fleet has been destroyed twice. Once at Pearl Harbor, now again at Midway. The public is demanding answers. How did this happen? Why weren't we prepared? Some people are calling for Roosevelt to be impeached. Others are demanding the military leadership be fired. There's a real crisis of confidence in the government's ability to win this war. And here's the worst part. America's industrial advantage hasn't kicked in yet. It's still 1942. The factories are just starting to gear up for war production. The new Essex-class carriers that will dominate the Pacific in our timeline won't be ready until 1943. The shipyards are building them as fast as they can, but it takes time. So for the next year, maybe longer, America has no way to challenge Japan at sea. The Japanese know this. They have a window of opportunity to consolidate their gains and build defenses that will be incredibly hard to break. Japan starts fortifying every island they control. Wake Island, Guam, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, Rabaul, Truk. They turn these places into massive fortress bases with airstrips, gun emplacements, and thousands of troops. In our timeline, the Americans had to fight brutal battles to take these islands back. In this timeline, with an extra year or more of fortification time, these islands become nearly impregnable. The cost of taking them back would be astronomical. Let's jump ahead to 1943. America finally has new carriers ready, but Japan has had a year to prepare. They've built new carriers too. They've trained new pilots. They've established a defensive perimeter that stretches from the Aleutian Islands down to New Guinea and across to Burma. Breaking through that perimeter is going to cost tens of thousands of American lives. The island-hopping campaign that MacArthur and Nimitz executed in our timeline was already brutal. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, all of those battles had horrific casualties. In this timeline, every single battle is worse because the Japanese have had more time to dig in and they have more confidence because they won at Midway. The Japanese military culture emphasizes fighting to the death. They're not surrendering these islands without a fight. Every island becomes a meat grinder. American casualties start piling up. The public back home is getting war-weary. The draft is pulling men from every town in America. Gold Star banners are going up in windows everywhere, signaling that a family's son has died in the Pacific. And for what? To take back some tiny islands most Americans have never heard of? The isolationist voices that were silenced after Pearl Harbor start getting loud again. People are asking why we're fighting Japan's war when we should be focused on defeating Germany in Europe. And that's another problem. In our timeline, America fought a two-ocean war, but the focus was on Europe first. Defeat Germany, then deal with Japan. In this timeline, with the Pacific situation so dire, there's enormous pressure to shift resources away from Europe and toward the Pacific. But if we do that, what happens to Britain? What happens to the Soviet Union? They're counting on American supplies and eventually American troops to open a second front. If those resources get diverted to the Pacific, the European war could go badly too. Maybe D-Day gets delayed from 1944 to 1945 or even 1946 because we don't have enough landing craft or troops available. Every landing craft sent to the Pacific is one less available for the invasion of France. The Soviet Union, already taking massive casualties fighting Germany, might lose patience with the Western Allies. Stalin could decide to cut a separate peace deal with Germany, or at minimum, the Cold War tensions that develop after the actual war happen earlier and more intensely. Back in the Pacific, there's another nightmare scenario: the atomic bomb. In our timeline, America developed the bomb in 1945 and used it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force Japan's surrender. In this timeline, the war is dragging on longer and costing more American lives. The pressure to use the bomb, maybe multiple bombs, is even stronger. But where do you drop it? Do you bomb Tokyo and kill millions of civilians? Do you bomb every major Japanese city until they surrender? The moral calculations are even darker because American casualties have been so much higher. The public might demand it. Wipe Japan off the map if that's what it takes to end the war. Let's say the war finally ends in late 1945 or early 1946. Japan surrenders after multiple atomic bombs destroy their major cities. The death toll on both sides is staggering. Maybe twice as many American servicemen dead compared to our timeline. Japanese civilian casualties could be in the tens of millions from the extended war, firebombing, and nuclear weapons. China has lost millions more to famine and atrocities. The entire Pacific region is devastated. Here's the moment that defines this alternate timeline. It's August 1945. American forces are finally closing in on Japan after 3 years of brutal island fighting. Every island taken has cost thousands of lives. Iwo Jima was hell. Okinawa was worse. The Japanese have fought fanatically, knowing that losing means the end of their empire. American military planners are looking at the invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, and the casualty estimates are terrifying. 500,000 American dead, maybe more. Millions of Japanese casualties, both military and civilian. And then the atomic bomb is ready. In our timeline, 2 bombs ended the war. In this timeline, with hatred and casualties so much higher, there's serious discussion about using 10 bombs, 20 bombs, however many it takes. Flatten every major city in Japan until they surrender unconditionally. There's less sympathy for Japanese civilians because American casualties have been so devastating. The desire for revenge is overwhelming. The bombs fall. Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Osaka, Kyoto, maybe more. Millions die instantly. Millions more from radiation sickness in the following months. Japan finally surrenders, but the country is a radioactive wasteland. The human cost of this extended war is almost beyond comprehension. And all of it traces back to one battle, one moment, for minutes that went differently in June 1942. So that's what happens if Japan wins at Midway. The American carrier fleet is destroyed. Japan controls the Pacific for another year or more. Hawaii is threatened. Australia and New Zealand are isolated. China collapses. The island-hopping campaign becomes even more brutal and takes longer. American casualties skyrocket. The war drags into late 1945 or 1946. And when it finally ends, it ends with nuclear devastation on a scale that makes our timeline look merciful. The Battle of Midway wasn't just important. It was the hinge point of the entire Pacific War. If Japan had won, everything changes. The war lasts longer. More people die. The world that emerges from that war is darker, more broken, and more traumatized. And the scary part? Japan came incredibly close to winning. For minutes. That's how close we came to living through this nightmare timeline. The men who fought at Midway, especially those torpedo bomber crews who died drawing the Japanese fighters away, they saved the Pacific War. Their sacrifice gave those dive bombers the opening they needed. And because of that, because of 4 minutes of perfect timing, the war ended sooner and millions of lives were saved. That's how fragile history really is. That's how much we owe to the people who fought those battles. They didn't just win. They prevented a catastrophe. Hit subscribe if this changed how you see history.